Hello, my name is Todd Curtis Narron, and it's time for terror. I'm going to be your personal boogeyman and tell you a story. Not just any story, but a true story. The story's name is The Bloating. Now let me tell you what the bloat is. You see, after a body dies, it begins to rot, filling with horrible and terrible smelling gases that makes it twist and contort and swell to the point of bursting open. This is what we call the bloat. Now here's the story, and I hope you enjoy it as much as I've enjoyed telling it to you. Having grandmas and granddaddies were always a big part of growing up. It was a blessing to be with them. It seemed they always had time to be with you. I mean, really be with you. Whether it was taking you to the country store and buying you the things you wanted with what little money they had, or letting you have your own time to do the things you wanted to do, like playing with the chickens and dogs as they just sat and smiled. Everything us kids did. Well, almost everything made them so happy that you were one of them and that you belonged to them. At least, this is the way it was for me and my brother. Now, the story I'm about to tell you is how life usually goes between grandparents and grandchildren. It all begins in a little community called Indian, which, if you turn that word around, is time, spelled backwards. The time wasn't exactly going backwards there, but it did roll by real slow like. So, there was a family that lived a mile or two down the road from my people called the Preacher Black family. They called him that because the older man that lived there was a preacher, and he and his wife's last name was Black. Our families didn't visit much, and I guess that was because of all the drinking and all the other things my family members were involved in. Well, the Blacks raised some fine children on preaching and farming. Yes, they did. And it wasn't long before they grew up and had them some grandchildren to love up on. Now, just like the rest of us kids, they loved to stay with Ma and Pa, which is what they called their grandparents. It seemed like every time you saw Ma Black, she had one of them grandbabies right with her. Now, I was just a kid, but I remember when I'd see her at the local store, she was always saying that she could just take them grandbabies of hers and grease them down and eat them. Some good times happened with their family for a while. But then the old devil had to show up and put the arthritis in the backbone of Ma Black. Old Ma Black stayed strong for a while and worked the garden, kept the house, and let the babies spend the night whenever they wanted. It wasn't long before the arthritis got worse, though. She began to get slower and show pain in her face whenever she moved. Ma Black got to hurting so bad that she mostly just laid in bed or shuffled around the house with her poor back bent over holding a rag, dusting things she could reach. She had a grandson named Will, and he came to school always smelling like that mint pain cream. When we asked him why he smelled like that, he told us it was the medicine he had put on his mom's back to ease the pain in her bones just a little. Will was about 10 years old, and I know that because we were in the same 5th grade class together. Will and I played at recess, but we never went to each other's house. We weren't that close, but close enough. And after a while, Will stopped playing at recess and started sitting by the schoolhouse. Sometimes I'd go sit with him and ask him what was wrong, and he would always say that he was worried about his mom and tell me about her lying in bed and dusting with the old rag, all the while whispering in a low voice that he really couldn't make out. Will told me right then and there that he would always be there and take care of her as long as she needed him. Every day after school, he would walk over to her house and help out with things, and it got to where he would spend the night and sleep beside her. We thought this was a little funny, but he slept with her because she would first hold him with her arm wrapped around him and they would say the prayers. And when that was over, She would turn it over and press her aching back into his so the warmth and pressure would relieve her pain. I don't know why the preacher didn't do more for her, but he didn't and never did. And he would always sleep in another bed, no matter how much she needed him. Eventually, Preacher Black died, and Will's parents made Will Ma Black's main caregiver. So for a few years, they would spend the night together back to back, and she would whisper the word pain over and over until she went to sleep. I wondered sometimes, just sometimes, if he wished that she would just fly away and be at peace so he wouldn't have to keep her all the time. Everybody was real proud of Will for taking care of her, but life has a way of changing things. And as Will got older, he started to get interested in going out with friends and flirting with girls like the rest of us boys do. Eventually, he began to slow down with the caregiving. He began to skip a day or two on going to see her. When Will turned 16, his parents got him a car, and just like any other kid, he just wanted to have fun. And sleeping with your grandma, well, that wasn't exactly fun. So the visits to her grew longer and longer apart until it got to where he wouldn't even look at her house when he drove by because he was ashamed of himself. When his parents would ask about her, he would say she was okay, and he was stopping to see her every day. That boy was lying. Will got so wrapped up in his own life that he drove by a whole week without looking her way or even beeping the horn. Finally, his conscience got to him, and he stopped on his way back from school at the end of that week. He told some people that he went in the back screen door and smelled a rotten scent, so he moved slowly through the rest of the house, going from room to room. As the smell got worse, there was a light buzzing sound that began to get louder and louder as he walked almost on his tiptoes through the house until he finally got to her room. The door was a little bit open, so he took his fingers and gently pushed it wider. When Will looked inside, he saw Ma Black laying on the bed in a full state of bloat, with her whole body swollen, arms and legs lifted off the bed. Her head was twice as big with her mouth stretched open and her tongue sticking out, pushing her top false teeth out sideways, barely hanging to her purplish and infested gums. The eyes were bulging and covered in a thick, milky haze of some kind of buildup that kept her eyes from shutting. And her nightgown was wet as the oozing of some kind of liquid was seeping through the skin. There were at least 100 big old flies buzzing around her. The maggots were so thick it gave the body an odd appearance of actually moving a little. If that wasn't enough, the skin had turned green and there was a pinkish foam coming from her nose. Everything in Will told him to run, but instead he ran and got a towel and went back to the body and tried to push the maggots off and kill the flies. He even pushed down on the arms and legs, but the buildup of the gases just made them pop back up again. He did all he could do to make her look better, like taking the eyelids and pulling them up and over her eyes, only for them to slowly set back in place, leaving the eyes exposed with their milky gaze staring at the ceiling. Poor Will tried everything he could, but it was too late. The rot had set in, just like the guilt he was feeling for not being there for her sooner. Will said it was the most horrible thing he had ever seen or wished to see again. But telling his parents about her death was just as hard, because he knew they were going to blame him for the bloating. He admitted it was his fault, because if he would have just taken a few moments to stop by every day, she wouldn't have gotten in that awful way. The man who comes to pronounce you dead came and did his job. And then the funeral home folks came and got the body. They had a funeral and all, but the casket had to stay closed because of the condition of the body. In fact, when Ma Black's children asked to see the body, the funeral home folks said it was the dangest thing, but the body just wouldn't get out of the bloating stage. And no matter how many times he attempted to deflate the body, it would just swell back up again. They told him it was better to just remember Ma Black the way she was in her younger days. But Will's guilt was crushing, and every time a family member would look at him, he thought to himself how much he was to blame. After the funeral was over, Will was taken over with anxiety and depression, and soon after, his parents sent him to the hospital mental ward in Smithfield, North Carolina, for a few days to see if they could help him and maybe get him on some medication for his tormented mind. But they never really could. After he got settled in at the hospital, he would spend his days sitting in silence, staring out the window or just looking at the other patients who were milling around, all knowing they were locked behind closed doors. He was made to go to group meetings, but he would never talk about what he had been through that led him there. Finally, after 7 days, the hospital let Will go home with a list of medications to fight off the bad thoughts in his brain. Well, Will took the medication, and it seemed to help, although he never did come back to school. You see, the young people couldn't let Will just be Will anymore. He was now whispered to be Crazy Will. I don't really think that was fair for folks to do because we all got our problems. Shoot, I'm even tormented by some of the same things Will has, and I wouldn't want to be called crazy. Nobody would. Will was home, and in the daytime, he kept busy, but at night, when he would go to bed, his daddy would turn on a dim light and close the door. Will would pull the covers up and face the wall and fight the demons in his head. He would try his best to fall asleep, but after about an hour of just laying there, he would start to sniff a rancid smell and hear the door slowly open. He would try to yell, but no words would come out. He would hear the light buzzing of flies, the squishing noise of maggots twisting on each other, and the sound of legs rubbing together coming toward his bed. He could feel the covers pull back and the weight of a body lay next to him, while an arm reached around him and she would rest her bloated arms around his shoulders. He could feel his hair getting wet from the foam coming from her nose, and the slick wetness that oozed from her body would be absorbed into his skin. Will would be screaming inside the whole time as he heard the whispering of Ma Black slowly trying to say, "Get," or "Run," or something like that. After a while, she would roll over, shaking the whole bed, and push her back into his like she had done so many times before. Will would lay there all night until about 4 o'clock in the morning, when Ma Black would decide to roll back over, kiss Will on the head, and then she would get out of bed and walk out of the room, leaving the poor kid exhausted and scared to death. The same thing happened to him every night, no matter where he went to bed, at home, the mental ward, even the barn. There was nowhere for Will to go because at night she would always find him. After a while, a long while, Will began to somehow cope with the nightly visits until one night Ma Black laid down next to him and whispered something clearly, which were the words, "Get up." So that is what he quickly did. And as he looked back at her in bed, she was pointing at the door and said, "Run! Run fast as you can." Now Will did just that. He ran as fast as he could, out the door and through the woods in the dark of the night. The next morning his mom and daddy couldn't find him, and began looking everywhere, only to find him 3 days later with a sharp limb that had fallen from a tree stuck clean through his body that he must have run into in the dark. 3 days in the heat of summer can be hard on a dead body, and when they found poor Will, he was was covered in flies and maggots and in a state of full bloat. The weird thing is, Will didn't do anything different than the rest of us grandkids do. At first, when we were young, we loved to be with our grandparents, but as we get older, well, we seem to get interested in other things and take them for granted, like they will always be there. Your grandparents will always love you because, like I said earlier, you belong to them, and you will always love them because they belong to you. The only thing they ask is that you spend a little time with them. My folks would sometimes bring up Will and what happened to him, and my granddaddy would say, "You see what happens when you don't take care of your old family members? Next thing you know, that'll be me laid in the back room all bloated up and turned green." Maybe my granddaddy was one of the reasons the Preacher Black family didn't come to visit us. Well, I hope you enjoyed that story, and I hope it brought you a little terror.